"Can you give me a hug, please?" A poor girl asked the single dad. His reaction left her in tears. The man sat alone at the small cafe table near the edge of the sidewalk. His posture calm, but his eyes distant, as if they were always carrying memories heavier than the quiet around him. Being a single father had changed the way he saw the world. Life no longer rushed past him. Instead, it pressed slowly, deliberately, demanding patience, strength, and sacrifice every single day. Since losing his wife, he had learned how to survive without leaning on anyone. He worked, raised his son, paid the bills, and returned home to silence that no one else seemed to notice. Emotions were something he kept neatly folded away. Not because he didn't feel them, but because he couldn't afford to fall apart. He noticed the girl before she spoke. There was something about the way she stood that made her different from the hundreds of people who pass by every hour. She wasn't confident, but she wasn't careless either. Her blue dress clung to her frame, clean but worn, as if it were one of the few things she owned that made her feel presentable. Her hair was tied up hastily, strands loose, suggesting she hadn't stood in front of a mirror for long. She lingered near him, hesitating, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, clearly fighting with herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if she already expected rejection. She asked him for a hug. The words felt unreal, too simple to carry the weight behind them. For a moment, he thought he had misheard. People asked for money all the time. Some asked for help, directions, or sympathy. But this was different. This was raw, unguarded, and terrifyingly honest. His first reaction was silence, not because he was angry, but because the request touched something deep inside him that he hadn't visited in years. He looked at her face carefully, noticing the tiredness around her eyes, the way her lips trembled slightly as she waited for his answer. She wasn't acting. She wasn't manipulating. She was standing there with nothing but vulnerability. She began to explain before he could respond, her words tumbling out as if she were afraid she might lose her courage. She said she hadn't hugged anyone in years, that life had become a series of closed doors and polite indifference. She spoke of growing up without stability, of learning early that depending on people often led to disappointment. She wasn't asking him to fix anything. She just needed to feel human again, if only for a moment. He listened, his hands tightening around the coffee cup as memories surfaced uninvited. He remembered hospital rooms, late-night prayers, and the unbearable moment when holding someone wasn't enough to keep them alive. He remembered the first time his son asked where his mother was and how his voice had broken mid-sentence. He had promised himself then that he would be strong, that he wouldn't let pain soften him into helplessness. But standing there in front of him was someone whose pain looked different but felt familiar. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, patient, and deeply lonely. He glanced around briefly, aware of passing eyes and unspoken judgments. The world had rules about distance, about strangers, about what was considered acceptable. Yet none of those rules seemed more important than the moment unfolding in front of him. He stood up slowly, careful not to startle her. For a second, she stepped back, her eyes widening as if she feared she had crossed a line. Then he opened his arms. There was no rush, no sudden movement, just an invitation. She hesitated, then stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. The hug was gentle at first, respectful, almost cautious. Then she leaned in, and something inside her finally gave way. Her body shook as silent tears fell, soaking into his shirt. He felt her shoulders tremble, felt the weight of everything she had been carrying settle briefly against him. He didn't speak. He didn't pull away. He simply held her, steady and present, the way he had once held his wife, and the way he now held his son. When the world felt too big for him, time seemed to slow. The noise of the street faded into the background. To anyone watching, it might have looked like an ordinary embrace, but to them, it was something far more meaningful. It was acknowledgement. It was proof that kindness still existed without conditions. When she finally stepped back, her face was wet with tears, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and relief. She wiped her cheeks quickly, apologizing over and over, but he shook his head gently, telling her there was nothing to apologize for. Her eyes met his again, this time softer, lighter, as if a small piece of her burden had been lifted. She thanked him quietly and turned to leave, walking away with a pace that felt steadier than before. He watched her disappear into the crowd, feeling something shift inside his chest. As he sat back down, the coffee in front of him forgotten, he realized that the hug had changed him too. A door he had kept locked for years had opened, just enough to let something human back in, without him knowing that this moment was only the beginning. Days that followed did not rush past him the way life usually did. Instead, they lingered, quietly reshaping his thoughts. He found himself replaying the moment in small fragments, not obsessively, but gently, as if his mind was trying to understand why such a simple act had left such a deep mark. While preparing meals for his son, while helping with homework, while sitting in traffic, the memory returned without warning. It wasn't the girl's tears that stayed with him the most, but the relief in her eyes when she realized she didn't have to be strong for once. His son noticed the change before anyone else. Children had a way of sensing emotional shifts long before adults did. He asked why his father seemed calmer, why his voice sounded warmer at night. The man struggled to explain that sometimes healing doesn't come from solving problems, but from acknowledging them. He told his son that being kind didn't make a person weak, and that listening could matter more than speaking. The boy nodded, accepting the lesson in the simple way children do, without questioning its complexity. Across the city, the girl moved differently through her days. Nothing in her life had magically improved, but something inside her had settled. The hug had not erased her struggles, yet it had reminded her that she was not invisible. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that asking for comfort wasn't a failure. That belief alone changed the way she carried herself. She applied for jobs again, walked into places she had avoided, and spoke with a voice that, though still quiet, no longer shook. Their paths crossed again by chance, in a way neither of them expected. He was with his son when he saw her, and recognition flashed across his face immediately. She froze, uncertain whether he would remember her or whether that moment had only lived in her memory. He smiled and greeted her naturally, without surprise or awkwardness, as if their meeting had been inevitable. He introduced her to his son, not as someone in need, but as someone he respected. The boy's easy smile caught her off guard. There was no curiosity about her past, no silent judgment in his eyes. He spoke to her as if she belonged there, and that simple acceptance stirred something deep within her. They talked for a while, about ordinary things that felt extraordinary in their simplicity. Favorite foods, small dreams, and moments that brought comfort. The heaviness that had once defined their connection was replaced with something quieter and more balanced. Over time, their conversations continued. Not every meeting carried emotional weight, and that was what made them meaningful. She learned about his late wife, about the fear of raising a child alone, about the pressure of being strong when there was no one else to lean on. He learned about her love for writing, about the words she had never shared because she believed no one wanted to hear them. They didn't rush to label what was growing between them. Trust formed slowly, built on honesty rather than need. He helped her find work through a connection at the cafe. Not out of pity, but because he believed in her capability. She began to find stability in small steps, each one reinforcing her sense of worth. In return, she brought warmth back into his life, reminding him how to laugh without guilt and how to open his heart without fear of loss. One evening, she told him that the hug had saved her. He corrected her gently, telling her that she had saved herself by asking for it. That moment, he explained, had taught him something too. That strength didn't mean isolation, and that compassion could exist without boundaries being crossed. Their story did not unfold like a fairy tale. There were setbacks, doubts, and moments of uncertainty. But there was also growth, patience, and understanding. Two lives, once weighed down by different kinds of loneliness, found balance through a single act of humanity. For those who come across stories like theirs and choose to stay, to listen, and to return for more, the lesson is simple yet powerful. Real change begins when we allow ourselves to connect, even in the smallest ways.